My name is Deborah House. I'm an MCN board member. Please tell me how later, at some other time, if you're having a great time at the conference. Being involved in the MCN is a really wonderful thing. I'm sorry I discovered it so late in my career. I should have been doing this for a long time. And it was my great pleasure to put this panel together for you this morning. Just so you know a little bit more about me, I don't just work on the board for free. I also teach for Johns Hopkins University, the MA program in Museum Studies. And there's a person, Phyllis, who if you don't know, you should know, who's really friendly, who can tell you all about that program. I also consult on digital projects and strategies. And I was inspired to create this panel by two very specific, completely non-related events that happened in the last year or so. First was the birth of what I claim to be the most important museum to open in the 21st century, represented by two people that you will meet in shortly. And second, by the publication of one of my oldest and dearest colleagues, who you also meet in a minute, which documented some important lessons for all of us to learn about the difficulty of changing culture in museums and to make them, most importantly, visitor-centered. And so, oh gosh, I have a slide that actually illustrated what I just told you. So my challenge to our panel was that we need to keep it real. We need to keep it practical. We all want to be more inclusive in our institutions. So how do we get started? What can we do to get the ball rolling? And so here are the formal introductions. Oh, we have our table tents. Fantastic. So, but anyway, they need their proper introduction. From the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, we have first Adam Martin, the Chief Digital Officer, who comes to museums from a background in public media, technology, and community-driven startups. Today, Adam will share examples of the ways technology and digital experiences can foster a more inclusive museum environment, as well as how technology can strengthen a museum's connection to its community and make its collections, programs, and exhibitions all more accessible. To the far end of the table, Lanae Spruce. She's the manager of social media and digital engagement at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. She's working to build the museum's digital media presence, to foster learning, creativity, and shared discovery as a means to transform our understanding of the African American experience, American history, race, and modern society. She holds a master's degree in internet marketing and describes herself, this is a great name, as a curious creative, interested in opportunities to connect the intersections of technology, race, social justice, and history. And in between the two people I just introduced is Peter Samis. He is no stranger to the MCN community. He's also the Associate Curator of Interpretation at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and he has spent his career there, pretty much, fostering meaningful connections between artworks and audiences. A longtime leader in the field of interpretive media, in recent years, he has focused on the larger questions of museum interpretation, both analog and digital, on-site and online. We have so many platforms these days. And Samus's book, which he co-wrote with Mimi Michelson, Creating Visitor-Centered Museum, and co-authored, sorry, I said that already, published by Routledge earlier this year, and that's what you see here. And I'm forgetting to advance the slides, but know that all of what I just said is here, and particularly note that I've included the Twitter handles, and feel free to use those, and any little thing that you might want to say during or after the session, because we're all actively on Twitter, and we can respond to you that way as well. And that is my goal right now, just to introduce the speakers. I'm going to ask Adam to come up now and begin the presentations. We imagined this and we've organized it to be interactive to a certain extent, so be prepared to respond and act and maybe even stand up. I think you'll enjoy the panel, and thank you for coming.
I'm not going to even attempt this. I'm going to leave this right here. See, okay. Getting over a cold, so I've been keeping my water. And I just lost our. So I will restore us here.
This is what happens in every technology session. Yeah.
Overly challenging, making it harder than it needs to be.
Yeah.
But thank you all for joining us this morning. And I will go into my presentation mode here as well. And so I really just want to talk to you about a few things that we do at the museum and the ways that our team especially thinks about uses of technology and thinks about all the ways that we can use technology really in the service of our visitors and in the service of our communities. I think that's the way I like to approach all these things. We talk often about not just doing technology for technology's sake, but really looking at it as a way that we further the mission and the goals of the museum itself. And really that's all about putting our visitors and the community to which we belong to at the center of everything we do. So when we think about that and when we talk about that, we really look at it from three different perspectives, and that is our in-museum experiences, what we do online and in virtual spaces, and then actually getting out into the community as well. And this one is something that's really important for me, is make sure that we take that technology out of the museum, but not just to our online platforms and channels, but actually can we bring technology into the community to help connect people back with the museum, back with the programs that we're doing. Really, again, as I started by saying, to be in service to the community. You heard Deb mention at the beginning as she was giving my bio, thank you for that. My background going back, I started off as a journalist working in public media and really wanting to do that type of community level storytelling and thinking about ways that local media organizations could be in service to the communities of which they're a part of. I've been with the Smithsonian now only for about a year and a half after a decade and a half career at different media organizations at different levels. And what attracted me there was really the alignment of the mission of the Smithsonian and how closely it mirrored the mission of public media organizations in this country, and really that idea of creating a more informed public, about civic engagement, about how education is so critical and so important, but really, again, being involved and engaged with the community, inviting the community into everything that we do, so that we really reflect who it is that we're serving, and we're not these institutions sort of on the hill, as it were, or in the center of our communities, but somehow still disconnected, but we're really there in service to them. And so again, what we want to do is at the museum is really connect all of these experiences. We know we're fortunate to be down on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. and attract millions of visitors every year, but we also know there's millions more that will never have that opportunity to come to Washington, D.C. to experience our museum in person. So we do things online, and we're facing and meeting all the same challenges that I'm sure many people in this room are with how to use our digital channels and spaces to bring the museum to more communities. But then we bring it right back down to the community level again, and we look at who can we collaborate with and who can we partner with to really get down at that really personal community level to help understand what the needs are there and bring things from the museum to those people. So I'm just going to share with you a few examples of how we approach that and how we do that. One of the projects you may have heard about, and we'll talk about more, and Lanae may even touch on as well, is our visitor reflections booths at the museum. And so on each of the three history gallery levels of the museum, there is a video recording booth that we encourage all our visitors to go and sit down, and you have the opportunity to record up to a 2-minute video in response to questions that are drawn from the exhibitions. And really what we're finding, many people are just using it as an opportunity to share their experience at the museum. Many people just giving thanks for the opportunity to really share their reactions to what they've just gone through. It can be a very emotional journey for many of our visitors, especially going through those lower history galleries of the museum. For those of you who may have had an opportunity to visit, can be a very powerful and sometimes overwhelming experience for people. So they come into the visitor reflections booths, they share their stories, they share their reactions and their responses. Here you see we've captured just some of the different faces that you see there. And what the technology allows us to do is a couple of things. One, it allows us to almost immediately share these videos back with our visitors. So before they leave the museum, if they've chosen to, they'll receive an email with a link to download that video that they've recorded that they can then share with their family and friends, share on their social networks. A lot of people have responded to us to just say what a meaningful keepsake that is for them of their museum visit experience. Especially when you see here, we have a lot of multi-generational families who come and visit at the museum. So that idea that you could come with a parent or a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt and sort of sit down with them, and they get an opportunity to share their stories and their own histories, and then you're able to kind of walk away from the museum with that, is a very powerful thing for many people, and they're just grateful for that opportunity. The other thing it's allowed us to do is create a great repository of these videos for our oral histories team at the museum, and give much of the credit due to Kelly Navies, who's our oral historian with the museum, who was really the person who conceived this project from the beginning. It's been a fantastic resource for them just to dive into and begin to understand how people are understanding the exhibitions at the museum, what their reaction has been to what they've just seen. I think we're up over 30,000 recordings now since last September when we first opened to the public, and so we're really building up a body of material for researchers and historians. And then it's lent itself to some great public programs in the museum and online that we've been able to share. We actually took a number of these videos and incorporated them into our first anniversary video that we showed at the museum earlier this year in September, and is still being shown at the theater at the museum. And it's been a really, really just powerful thing to see people see versions of themselves reflected in the museum, in museum stories. So even if it's not personally them and their story that was recorded that we may have shown in the video, just the idea that we're showing, you know, and I'll do the big air quotes, regular people sharing their stories in the museum. People have remarked on, you know, what a important thing that was to see that in a museum space, that these are not, you know, all PhD historians. These are not all people of note or celebrities or whatever it may be. These are our museum visitors. These are people in our community and from across the country, from a range of backgrounds, who've chosen to come and share their stories. And then so sharing those back to the public has become a really important part of this project for us. And I know Lanae is going to talk a little bit more about it through the Visitor Voices campaign, which was an online social media campaign that we did, where we shared a number of these stories back around different themes. Again, just really taking that opportunity when we talk about inclusivity, the really important part is meaning it and following it through. So it wasn't enough just to give people the opportunity to record their stories, but really sharing them back and saying, you know, this is the value and the strength of our community, is this diversity of voices and backgrounds and experiences. Another way we use technology in the museum to encourage, you know, sort of empathy and thinking and feelings of inclusion is our lunch counter interactive. This is one of the really big pieces of technology that we have in the museum. But what it does is encourage people to sit down and put themselves in the space and in the place of a young student protester in Greensboro, North Carolina, during these sit-ins. And they're presented with a number of questions or almost sort of decision trees around what would you do if someone approached you in this space while you were eating your lunch. If it was a police officer, if it was an angry white person who was upset that you were there, how would you respond to those things? What would you do when you were faced with these other very difficult, challenging decisions? And I think it's a great way to get people to sort of connect with that time in a very real way. There's also education questions for teachers and parents, and we've had a number of different school groups come in and work with us and work with our education team around creating those questions and helping us really, again, understand how are students responding to these things? How are students now, 60 plus years later from these events, who are really, you're talking about several generations back for them to build a connection to that time and sort of understand what that may have been like. And I think what we're finding is there's a lot that is relevant to today's students and to today's young people and people in our country now. And that challenge maybe wasn't quite as difficult or challenging as we may have liked to think to build those connections. But again, it's really all about putting people in a space and in a place and giving them an opportunity to really be thoughtful about the ways that we empathize and the way that we think about the roles that others have had to play throughout our history. Moving outside the museum, we talk a lot about our online exhibitions. One of the projects that I've been really excited about and really glad to be a part of and work on is our Mini Lenses project. This is a collaborative effort between different Smithsonian museums, and is really one of the few times where we've done this starting from the beginning as an online-only exhibition. It started with this idea of we wanted to do more joint exhibitions between the museums, and we sort of quickly found that the logistics of that were just really challenging. And so, of course, somebody said, well, we could just do it all online, as often gets thrown out and said. And instead of, sometimes I get a little frustrated by that, or I say, well, what does that really mean? With this project, we said, you know what, let's do that. Let's figure out what an online exhibition would mean for different museums. And so it started with our museum, the Museum of African American History and Culture, American History, and the Museum of the American Indian, really taking a look at different objects from our collections and the different perspectives that our own curators and our own historians and researchers have about these things. This idea that even within museum communities, there's not just one perspective. There's not just one history to share. So what you're looking at here is there's a series of these essays. One of everyone's favorites is around lowriders and car culture, and how car culture is just inherently American, right? In this way that we think about our cars and their connections to our communities. But what does that mean in the African American community? What does that mean in the Latino and American Indian community of the Southwest? What does that mean in the larger American community? So that was a really fun one to explore and see all those intersections. One of the other ones that was more challenging was around the Buffalo Soldiers. And so if you're familiar with Buffalo Soldiers, African-American segregated troops in the U.S. Army, late 19th century through early 20th century. And in the African-American community, this is often looked at as a source of pride. African-American soldiers, having agency for one of the first times in history, and often looked at, again, as I said, as something that, we look to and celebrate. In American history, it talks about that role of, westward expansion and this period of America becoming a great nation. And then during the conversations that we had, with our colleagues at American Indian, had to face this very other different reality of what it meant for American Indian communities in the West when Buffalo Soldier troops came into their communities, and having a very different perspective and needing to present all of those in order to understand the fullness and the totality of our history and really confront that. So again, giving a space for all of those different perspectives online was something that we could do that was unique, that would have been difficult and challenging to do in a museum space. And then for me, as I started by saying, in the community, and this might be the most important one for me, is how do we bring technology into the community? So this is a program that's actually going on right now. We started last weekend in Baltimore. It's continuing all this week, where we partnered with Impact Hub Baltimore to take our media digitization services that we do at the museum, where we collect oral histories, we digitize old photos and documents, 8mm, 16mm film, and create a digital community collection. And so we brought that technology out to a space in Baltimore, invited the community in for a week of free workshops and discussions, giving tips on how to preserve and digitize your family photo albums or other documents you have, but really giving them an opportunity. So you see a woman here with a document. I think it was a diploma, maybe. You see another woman here with all photos laid out, and one of our colleagues there working on digitization. This next one is we created an online space for them to upload easily at home as well, either through the web or through their phone. You see there some of the recent stories and connections that people were made and places they told stories about. So it's really about being in service to the community. Again, taking technology that we use in the museum, our digitization lab, and really scaling it down. We talk so often about how do we scale technology up and out. And this was an opportunity to say, we want to scale that technology down. How can we bring this out to a community space in a place like Baltimore and invite different groups in to sort of share this with them and get them involved? And so we have plans to bring this to other cities, really all across the country. But the hope is that it's something that can grow exponentially, that we can build this out so it's something that any of you can do in your communities in small ways as well. So it may not be doing film the way that we've done it, but really, simple flat scanners to do images and documents, converting VHS tape to an MP4 file. These are things that people were thrilled when we gave them this opportunity to bring in old wedding videos and birthday videos, and have those things be digitized and be shareable then as well. And it's really important to say, again, when we talk about inclusivity, is living it out, right? And so even when we do programs in the museum and we do things online, there's all sorts of barriers and challenges there to getting people engaged and making people feel like this is a welcome space for them and there's a way for them to contribute and engage with us. This is something that I think we want to continue to look to grow, which is to bring it out into the communities, go where they are. That first slide was all about NMHC being everywhere you are. This is a critical part of it, is making sure that we are in service to our communities. We talk a lot about our community, but really we're their museum. And so we want to make sure we're available and accessible to them, and it feels like it's something that belongs to them, and that this is something they can take advantage of. So
Should we go to questions?
I think we've covered everything. So I'd love if anyone has questions about any of these programs. I think that's my last one. Just 5 things to leave you with here, and then I'm happy to take questions. When we talk about inclusion and accessibility, make sure it's from the start. It's before even the planning of whatever projects and initiatives you're taking on. It's not something we can do after the fact. Inclusive design for all levels of learners. We talk a lot about that from a user experience and user interface, but also thinking about the language we use, the images and the visuals we use to share these things, to present them to the public, making sure we're being thoughtful about that, whether it's for school age groups or adult learners or our broader community. Be intentional. This is something I say a lot. We talk a lot about these things. Do it, and do it 100%, and do it with all the same energy that you do all the other aspects of your programs, your digital initiatives, whatever it is you do at your museum. For me, technology, it's all about, it enables, it inspires, it delights, right? It shouldn't be the thing. It shouldn't be the thing leading us. It should be something that allows for these other things to happen. And be a resource for the community. You heard me say that several times throughout this. And just always keep that in your mind, and I think that'll lead you on a good path. And so, yeah, if we have a couple minutes for questions, I'd love to, if anybody hear from anyone here, or would love to chat after. But I
Any
know we're on a tight time schedule too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just a small detail-ish question. I think it's so fantastic to bring people in and help them digitize. And you're saying that you're building with their materials, you're helping to build their, your own collections, everybody's collections. And so when you are helping people digitize, how does it work? I mean, like, do they just automatically, does their material automatically go to you guys, or how does?
Yeah, so everything is very much opt-in, right? If you came out to Baltimore this week and you wanted to digitize your family photo album, we hand you back a really cool, fun USB drive that looks like the outline of the museum. It has our little logo on it. But if you just want to take that home with you, that's great. That's yours to keep forever. You don't have to share those digitized photos with us. If you choose to, you check a little box on the form or when you registered for your digitization visit that says, absolutely, I'd love to have these be a part of the museum's online community collection. Of course, that's a very different thing, and sometimes explain that nuance between that and the Smithsonian collection, which has a much different process for how things become a part of that. And that's something that we talk to the people about, and during this process we share with them. But everything is their choosing. Same with the reflections booths. You can simply say, I want to record this, I want to save it and have it be emailed back to me, so I have that keepsake. But maybe this was a very personal memory, and so no, I don't want it shared with the museum. That's a simple thing. You just sort of check that box on the screen as you're going through that process. But yeah, good question. It's really, again, as I said, it's really all about in service to the people. It's not about building up our collection or great, we're getting lots of free, awesome content from the public to use in programming. It's really about them. We love it when they share it with us so that we can use it and make it available to other people, but it's totally up to the individuals.
Adam, maybe we'll cut to
Just,
Lanae now.
sure, yeah.
Is there a follow-up?
Right, just one thing, I wanted to also make a plug for those of you who are interested in doing that kind of work in the community. You can look at a project that came out of one of the National Digital Stewardship Residencies from the Library of Congress at DC Libraries Memory Labs.
Yeah.
Where they set up these kinds of scanning stations in the variety of the DC libraries.
Cool.
And they're great, it's great information online, you can go to
Sure.
How much do you intend to
Yeah, good,
capture from the community
good-
and incorporate?
good question, right? So when you talk about, now we're talking about scaling up, right? I talked a little bit about scaling down to get into community spaces. Now we're talking about scaling up. Yeah, I don't know. We've got a lot of support for it inside the museum right now. This was something that was important to us. I think we're hoping it's something that we can grow and support as a program over time. We see it as an important thing that the museum is doing. So as long as we can keep it a priority and show the successes that I think we've shown in this first year, I certainly hope there's a lot of continued support and meaning technology and financial support for it going forward. It certainly is it's a concern. Right now it's a lower concern. Storage costs keep going down and down and down, and so it's, getting started was the important thing to kind of learn and understand what it would cost. But I think there's, like I said, there's a lot of support for that, and there's a lot of support for that out in the community. We've already had people approach us and said, how can I support this further? But, how can I contribute to support this further? So thank you for those questions, but give
Yeah, and
over
thanks
to
for the
Lanae now.
DC library information, that's really
Yes.
great.
Hello, everyone. Our museum boldly and unapologetically tells the story of the American experience through the African American lens. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we approach engaging our visitors through our social media platforms. This is a short video that we produced in collaboration with our YouTube partners that looks at that history. So that video for us really looks at the African American experience. It showcases the tragedy, it showcases the triumph. So for us, if I can summarize the museum in one short 40-second video, it would be that. For us, when we approached telling stories on social media, we really looked at the Pew Research Center's data. African Americans comprise about 12 to 13% of the US population, but are overrepresented on platforms like Twitter and Instagram. So for us, it was very important that we created content to connect specifically with those audiences. We can also look at the core population of museum visitors. This chart here shows that 9% of museum visitors are minorities. How are you creating content online, which is the first time that many people will ever interact with your museum, that appeals to these user bases? This is an example, too, that looks at how African Americans and white Americans approach issues of race on social media. And what the Pew Research Center found was that African Americans overwhelmingly talk about issues of race and social justice. And so for us, as we approached talking about our digital engagement strategy, it was really important that we confronted these issues head on. Last year, I wrote a journal article for the Museum Education Roundtable. In that article, we really looked at and examined how our museum approaches social justice from an education perspective. I encourage you all to take a look at that article. We believe that all museums can participate in online discussions around race and social justice, and it will offer you tangible ways to do that through our public programming, through your education team, and also through your social media channels. This is an example of some of the programming that we've done at the museum. In 2014, after the death of Michael Brown, 2015, after the death of Michael Brown Jr., our director tasked us with starting a social justice initiative at the museum. Our History, Rebellion, and Reconciliation project allows visitors to come in to the museum and examine these issues, looking at community activism and mobilization, artistry, and also police and community relations. We also have active collecting within our museum, where we're collecting things as they happen. It's very important, I think, for our museum to not only, in the words of Lonnie Bunch, be a museum of the past, but to be a museum about right now. One of the things that we do as we approach our digital engagement strategy is we tell our story through different lenses. If you notice, our building is this huge, beautiful shape, and you might see some cutouts in that exterior shape that looks a little bit like this. So it allows us, when you're inside of the building, to look directly out. We're located on the America's National Mall, to see how African American history is ingrained in the national American story. You can look out and see the National Monument. You can look out towards the Lincoln and the Jefferson memorials and see how the story is connected in the fabric of the society. We also try to make emotional connections with our visitors. And we do that through things like ordinary objects. So this is a greens pot. It's actually from a restaurant in Washington, D.C. that was one of the first Black owner-operated soul food restaurants in the United States. Many people, especially if you're from the South, are very familiar with this kind of very large stock pot. So when we post and share things like this, our audience is able to connect to the museum from looking at ordinary, everyday objects. And we also, our Visitor Voices project, so this was a project that was started by Raven Ruffin, who's on my team, and she really wanted to talk to our visitors. We started this at our grand opening last year, and she went on the ground and interviewed visitors about their experience and how they engage with the museum. She takes black and white photos and posts their responses about visiting the museum. This year, we expanded that initiative to include videos that visitors recorded in our Reflections booth, and we worked to list about 30 videos, I think maybe like 31 now, and they're available on our website and on our YouTube channel. I just tweeted out a link if you're interested in seeing how our visitors respond. We also approach our strategy to expand common narratives. One of the things that we did that's really cool this year is we launched the second part of our tagline. So last year we launched A People's Journey, and this year we launched A Nation's Story. I thought it was very important that we looked at how African American history is connected and interwoven throughout the larger American history narrative. And for us, I really wanted to kind of flip history on its head. So when we use the hashtag A Nation's Story, we're injecting the African American experience around something common. For instance, Constitution Day, there are lots of museums tweeting, yay, yay, the Constitution was signed. But none mentioned that when the Constitution was signed, it included a 3/5 compromise that counted African American people as less than human. And that's what our museum does. We'll pull out those stories and share them online. Our Hidden Herstory project. So in addition to telling African American stories, how can we create narratives even within that community around other groups? So for us, it's very important that we uplift the stories of women. Last year, we launched a Hidden Herstory hashtag to examine women who made history, but their narratives weren't necessarily celebrated. This campaign is not only for African American women, but for any women throughout history whose story is undertold. It was a pretty successful campaign. We launched it on the first day of March. And what we wanted to do was to create a way for our visitors and other organizations to participate in this story. We developed a social media toolkit that was shareable online. And we also found really great images that appealed to users and allowed them to connect with the people that we profiled. This is an example of one of our animations that we did for YouTube. This video series looked at the history of African American women and feminism. This is actually one of my favorite YouTube videos. I work directly with our curators on these series, and what we wanted to do was to uplift the African American women's struggle for full racial and gender equality. It was a great video that went all the way back to the 1880s and looked at how African American women have always been advocating for agency. This is an example of our thread on Twitter, which we usually do to tell more stories or to keep our audience engaged over a longer period of time. For Women's History Month, the Hidden Herstory campaign, we started with one tweet. And every day in March, we updated that tweet thread with a new story about a different woman. It was largely successful, and our audience was able to go to one place to look at all these different stories. We also work directly with our digitization and archival teams to pull out videos from our collection. It's an example of someone just jamming in their basement, and we were able to take this footage and put it across all of our social channels. And we use the narrative of rent parties to tell this story. But that short 40-second video was viewed over 300,000 times across all of our platforms. We also tell the stories, again, within that African-American story, we still look at unheard stories and unheard narratives. Our museum is committed to uplifting the stories of LGBTQ African-Americans as well. We have a curator dedicated to collecting artifacts related to that history. And this year, for the first time, we hosted a tweet up around collecting LGBTQ artifacts during Pride Month. It was largely successful. It was attended by Dustin Lance Black, the filmmaker, which was really, really cool. Our curator was able to share stories, and what we found was that in every single one of our galleries, the museum is divided into history, culture, and community. You could find representation from an LGBTQ person, and that's really affirming. And people tweeted us, and they shared how beautiful it was that the museum was sharing this history and really being on the forefront as an African-American museum uplifting these stories. These are some examples of other institutions that I think have done a really great job at also telling different narratives. I always show this tweet by Nat Geo because I still can't believe they tweeted this, but it was around Columbus Day. Boom.
Can you read it? Can you read it?
It says, a reminder, Columbus Day celebrates a man who cut off the hands of indigenous people who didn't give him enough gold. Hashtag Indigenous Peoples Day. So I implore you all, this is an organization that is taking a narrative and flipping it on its head to think how you can do something like that. Think about your favorite museum or maybe the institution that you work at. Scroll down your feed. Look at your stories. Examine how you can add to a story or to a narrative that you're already telling. We work with a team at the United States Holocaust Museum as well to examine the African experience in the Holocaust. It was a really interesting storytelling to it because I found out so many things that I didn't know. And during Black History Month, the United States Holocaust Museum shares that narrative as well. So I think a lot of people hold on to, we don't do that. The African American story is not our mission, but I offer these examples to show you how other institutions can integrate their story within this and relate it to its own mission. Some tips: think outside of the common narrative. Connect with new audiences, and find intriguing stories. My colleague Erin that runs social at the American History Museum, I love, a few years ago, it was one of the anniversaries around the United States flag, and they shared the story of two African Americans, one indentured and one enslaved. And I thought it was really, really cool that during this story, she thought about a new way to connect and bring new audiences in. We also look at different ways to engage our audiences to make our social media strategy participatory. One of the ways we do that, again, this is an example of our social media toolkit project that we did for Women's History Month. And you can see here some different examples. If I click it. And what we were able to do was to allow organizations and to allow individuals to take our museum messaging and branding beyond our walls and beyond our institution. We use branded templates on social media. We get a lot of shares on Twitter. We get a lot of engagement. So what I want to do is make sure that when people are seeing these shares, that they come back to the museum and connect with us in a meaningful way. And these are some examples of other museums who participated. We also host Insta Meets, and this is an example of that collecting LGBTQ history tweet up that we did for Pride Month. So we use articles from our museum, from our collections, and we also use examples from other institutions. Lastly, I will leave with we integrate our museum social media strategy across the website. It's very important that we take the stories that are on our website and elsewhere and make sure that it's available to everyone. And looking at our collection stories, you can see here some examples of us taking those stories from the website and putting it out on our social media channels. And we also use tools like Giphy as well, so that we can highlight our archival film collection. These are some resources that I think would be great for you all if you would like to get into this inclusive social media strategy. Any questions? Yes.
I'm interested in your digital asset management because you're using a lot of materials and getting them up very quickly in a lot of different places.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find these things? Are they well tagged, right?
So I work directly with our Digi team. They've actually worked to tag all the images on our website so that it's embedding in all the images. And when we have a request, I don't search the collection. I just send it like, we're working on a video around sports protests. Send me all of the images related to sports and protests, and then I'll look at the list and select the images that we want to use, and then make sure that we use the rights information. What we've developed is taking some time to develop a great way, because they wanted this long credit line. I'm like, no, I don't want that. So what we decided to do was just make sure that we include the copyright and the gift line when we share on social. And Laura Coyle, the head of our Digi team at the museum, I think she's on Twitter as well. She can tell you more about their processes. I'm not that familiar with that work, if you're really interested. Any other questions? Yes.
In tandem to that, then all the content and text that's going with it, because you guys are doing so much, how do you make that a sustainable practice?
So right now, actually, I have 2 people on my team, and we usually have 2 interns each semester. What we do is our curators have written so much content. If you go to our museum, there's text everywhere. We take that text and we shorten it for our social media audiences. We also have a person on my team who has a master's degree in history, and she's our researcher. So she researches and finds stories, and we're able to become our own content producers. Any other questions? Thank you all.
Great, thanks.
Greetings, all. So we've just seen the powerful impact of this country finally stepping up to create a museum that honors African American history and culture. Art museums have been also been sites of white privilege to a great extent. And we continue to be challenged not only to find our ways to make our collections and exhibitions more relevant to our broader communities, beyond not just African Americans, but many others, white and otherwise, who have felt estranged or alienated or intimidated by our structures. So Detroit Institute of Art is a great case in point, where they've really kind of reinvented themselves to be more inclusive of their communities in all their range. So people without art historical training might find us opaque, intimidating, old school, ancient, anachronistic, equals unrelatable. With that in mind, Mimi Michelson and I did research leading to the book that Deb mentioned, where we actually did in-depth field visits to 10 different sites nominated by colleagues. And while they're mainly art museums, we knew art museums were not the most forthcoming and most generous and the most ready to innovate in most cases. And so we went to some history and multidisciplinary museums as well to look for further examples that we could map back to us. And then we had in-depth conversations. After a day of site visits, we would go in-depth with cross-departmental teams and individuals on the staff to really hear what their processes were, what their struggles were, and how they developed new practices. So I'm going to give 3 examples here very briefly. One is the Vaughn Museum in Eindhoven, Holland. And they've all been a bastion of modern and contemporary art, and they're very experimental and innovative. And now what they're innovating in is what they call radical hospitality. In other words, like continuing to present the cutting-edge contemporary art and modern art that they have in their collections and their current exhibitions, and finding ways to reach out beyond the norm of what a normal contemporary art museum would do to welcome a broad and diverse public into the experience and engage them in the experience of the contemporary art. So, for example, on the right, that's Dan Perchovsky's, one of about 100 cartoons that you have when you come in the entryway of the Van Abe, and that's the kind of big, great anonymous museum with all those, the centipede of legs of all the museum workers underneath, perceptible underneath. They've got a fabulous collection of the Russian constructivist artist El Lissitzky, the greatest outside of Moscow, and so they did this very innovative restoration of context, which included photographs and posters and agitprop things and slideshows and videos and archival films, as well as his works that you can see framed on the wall. And then, Lanae mentioned, how can we add to a story we're already telling? That's a story that they can tell all the time. They invited So now Lizitsky starts out at the beginning of the Russian Revolution with this idealist utopian, goal of remaking the world and using these abstract forms to leave behind the old kind of slave languages of the oppressive past. But then what happens is you get someone like Nedko Solikov, who's a contemporary artist from Bulgaria, who's at the opposite end of the Russian Empire dream/nightmare, as experienced from a satellite country under the yoke of Soviet oppression. And he is invited in to put a counter-narrative in very small mouse script graffiti over the grandiose Lizitsky idealistic quotes. So, for instance, it says here, we're striving to create social order, to raise the instinctive to a conscious level. And what you can't quite see is those over the level, the L is in level, there are these two little heads poking out like little stick figures saying, fuck you, fuck you. So he does all these little commentaries on these great, majestic Lizitsky quotes. And what happens then, this is something that art museums never do. We always give each person the full domain of their particular gallery, and their reality holds. What if we actually puncture that balloon and let another dialogue come in? How can we both tell the story and tell a counter-narrative in the same space? Very refreshing. It's amazing. Yeah. Making room for I Don't Get It at SF MoMA. This is the new building of SF MoMA. The Boda building, many of you are familiar with, is on the other side behind that hotel tower, the W, and behind the white building, which is our new Snowhead building. So the question, once again, same question. How can we let people with no art history background know they're welcome and their questions are valued, not stupid? Right? Because there's always the fear that I'm asking a stupid question and I'm not supposed to ask it here in this. So, since San Francisco is a tech capital, we actually invited the stars of Silicon Valley, Martin Starr and Kumail Nanjiani, to enter into dialogue with our curator, Caitlin Haskell. And here we go, let's see if I can get back in here. Play an excerpt.
Oh, here they are. You must be Martin and Kumail. Welcome to the museum, guys.
Oh, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for meeting us here.
Of course. And I've heard that you have some questions about works in our collection.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just like, I want to know what this is about.
Yeah.
Basically, I don't know anything about art or modern art specifically. And
You wanted to start here at Marcel Duchamp's fountain?
The urinal.
Yeah, it's a urinal. You're right.
Did he actually sculpt this himself, or did he take it off a bathroom wall?
Well, somewhere in between. So in 1917, he took a urinal from a hardware store, and he tried to submit it to an art exhibition, and it was rejected.
I cannot imagine why it was rejected.
Neither could he.
So he's like, you guys think you know what art is, but check this out.
Yeah, you think you're being really liberal and permissive. Well, on what grounds are you rejecting me? He could paint. I mean, he knew how to paint.
Is there any proof of it, or was that just what he said? Like, I could totally paint, guys.
No.
But instead, here's a urinal I found.
He's peeing on his contemporaries.
A little bit, yeah.
So why is this urinal art?
Well, art is supposed to be something that helps you feel feelings and have real emotions. And if the old art isn't letting you do that, you need to find new solutions. So what the museum tells you is art might not be something that actually moves you in the way that art is supposed to move you.
Okay, all right, okay. I'm totally on this guy's side now.
Oh, good.
I've really fully turned.
Good.
I emailed him.
No, he doesn't have an email.
Duchamp_urinal at gmail.com. Haven't heard back yet, but I think he's busy.
You won't.
Trying to get a commode into an art
He's
shop.
working on a bidet.
He's working on a bidet.
So that's an abridgment of about a 5-minute, thing. But I want to do a shout out here to our ace senior producer for content, Stephanie Powell, and her collaborators, Marianne McCune and Christine Murray at Detour and Antenna for what's a great tour, this I Don't Get It tour. And finally, a third example, Oakland Museum of California, right down the road from us, where they had a a gallery of California portraits, and they wanted their community to feel reflected in it. And they brainstormed lots of different ways to do it, and this is what it finally looks like. There are the portraits on the wall, and then there are these two little stations over there, and here's one of the products of, well, that developed at one of the stations. I'm going to have a short video about that that they produced, actually. Give you a sense.
The second section, and it's about California's people. The most prominent part of this section is what we call the portrait wall. We wanted to have visitors draw in our galleries because we wanted to encourage creativity.
We asked visitors some questions, and then we create this interactive, create a drawing using 3 lines. And some visitors did some drawings. They were okay and they were nice, but we thought it's not really inspirational. Well, then we brought in a mirror and we said, look in the mirror and draw yourself. And all of a sudden there's like this pop that happened, and the sticky drawings were like covering the whole wall.
Through testing, we found that the most compelling way for them to engage with drawing was if they drew themselves.
It was a way for them to make that personal connection was really important, and that's what sparked them to create. So then when we transferred over to a digital format where people could draw using the digital interactive. And then we realized too, it was a way we could have the flat screen on the California portrait wall. And that was a shift too, because now we're actually having visitors' works in the gallery.
The assumption is the curator controls the space totally, and that's actually a myth. To say that the visitor's not involved or shouldn't be involved is sort of not true.
The flip side is, I think visitors also recognize the challenge of being an artist. Try sitting down, looking at yourself in a mirror and drawing yourself. And I think it both gives visitors access to the fun and liberation and joy of the creative experience, but also an appreciation that it's really tough to be an artist.
That was Renee de Guzman, and who was their curator of painting and sculpture, and then Barbara Henry, who was their head of education and engagement, and Lori Fogarty, the director. So here's a thought exercise for you guys. Is your museum perceived as opaque or intimidating or old school, ancient, or perhaps irrelevant to today? If it's opaque, how could you open up the sealed bubble of discourse the way the Van Abbe did? Right? Multiply those voices, add something else, add a level. If it's intimidating, how could you speak more informally the way SF MoMA did with Martin and Kumail and the curator, all in dialogue, laughing together and honoring each other's POVs? And if it's ancient or old school or anachronistic, to some of your visitors, how could you include your visitors today in that story? On to Deb.
Actually, why don't you ask for questions?
Any
Then
questions?
we have to wrap.
Okay.
Any questions for Peter?
There we go. You're on.
Okay, well, I just wanted to, in like 2 minutes that we have left, I have an activity to share with you that comes out of my practice in design thinking that I use a lot with museums. And some of you have probably been to some of those sessions where they talk about making a persona and making a scenario. And we don't have time to actually walk you through it, which was my dream, but it's okay. Just think about the next time when you're sitting in a team meeting, hopefully like a planning meeting, and you're waiting for that last person to come, and you're all sitting around the table and there's nothing to do. Try this out. It's like planting a little seed. Take a page from yesterday's keynote and challenge your fellow team members to think about someone who doesn't see themselves in your museum. And that sounds like a very high-level thing, but it actually works pretty well. And challenge them to think of someone that they know, a real person, someone that they know well enough to sort of anticipate what they would say and do, and make that your persona. And as you go through the planning process, keep referring back to this person when you're making key decisions about where things are placed, or how big the font is, or how you're going to describe the introduction on the website, or how you're going to lead people around in the audio tour. Like, if each of you on the team had this shadow persona of someone who doesn't see themselves normally, regularly, whatever, in the museum, or maybe doesn't come to the museum at all for other reasons, such as, ADA type reasons, bring them into your practice. Because what I've noticed, and I try to teach my students this, is that we're all about teamwork. If you don't love working on a team, you shouldn't work in a museum. But the problem is, and I love working on a team, but the problem is there's something inherent in teamwork that works against what we're talking about today. And it's that the better you get at working in your team, and I've been on teams where people have been doing the same job for 30 years, right? I'm maybe one of them. We get so good at what we do, we don't stop to rethink what we do and to think about people who aren't part of that team, and we start assuming ourselves to be the audience. And that is a huge danger. Do not assume that if you work in a museum in any capacity that you can speak for the visitors. You must go back out and check yourself. You must keep it honest. And I think it sounds silly, and maybe you'll get a few giggles at first, but I do believe that this process of thinking about the persona that is not usually in your galleries or on your websites really helps keep you honest in that team process. So, any other questions that you want to try and get in, squeeze in there before we wrap?
Or responses.
There's one in the back.
Hi, I was just curious when Peter was sharing some examples of how the art museums know what the other questions are beyond art history, like how was that information or data collected?
Peter?
Well, I mean, it's actually, part of it is just to go out and ask people in the galleries. It is, and it's also people outside the galleries, people who don't come to your museums, find out why they don't come. That's exactly what Deb's talking about. It's developing those personas that are real people. I talk to people who have been art museum members for 30 or 40 years, but they still, when I talk to them after the fact, when they've gone, after their visit, they say, I had no idea what that was about, and they start asking me their questions. They admit their befuddlement, but it's the right thing to do to be a member of the art museum. It doesn't mean you're getting everything. In my book, there's a story of a director who had the trustees visiting the museum, and she had a very important call she had to take. She said, you just wait here a couple minutes, or no, go up into the galleries, I'll meet you in the galleries. And after her call, they were still in the lobby. They said, we don't know what to do in the galleries when you're not leading us. Okay, so let's get real. A lot of people don't know, even if they're members and they're lifelong members and they're doing the right thing by their local museum by being that, they still have a lot of questions. You can just ask them.
We got to wrap. We got another panel waiting. Thank you so much. You've been a fantastic audience.